How's it going, everyone? Today we'll be finishing up our conversation on the central nervous system. So last time we talked about the spine and the spinal column and all the information that goes up and down our spinal cord. But today we'll be talking about the brain. And just like most topics in this course, I'm only going to scratch the surface of the complexity of this organ. And so, it's quite the intricate computer that we have in our heads, and it's in charge of things like monitoring our breathing, our heart rate, taking in all this sensory information, the light, the sounds, the sensations. It has to process the motor output for hundreds of different muscles. We have thoughts that are developed from it. It, allows us to do many, many things, and it's in charge and it regulates many functions in our body. So again, it's a complex system, but I'll try to point out the most important things, the things you need to know at an introductory level. So just like the spinal cord, the brain is going to be protected by multiple different layers of different types of tissue. And so we have the cranium, which is, this skull, and it's this thick layer of bone that protects our brain. But we also have meninges, that connective tissue, which surrounds the nervous tissue. And so just like the spinal column, the same thing here. The most internal layer is that pia mater, followed by the arachnoid matter, and then the dura mater. Just like other cells within the body, the blood is going to need to be transported to the cells and the tissues within the brain in order to provide nutrients and get rid of waste products for the exchange of hormones and things like that. But the nervous tissue in the brain is very important, obviously. And so we can't just let any materials go to and from the blood to the brain. So we have these specialized capillaries with tight junctions, which we discussed in earlier chapters, and then astrocytes, which are cells that also help maintain the tightness of these capillaries. It's selectively permeable, more permeable than it normally would be because, again, the brain's such an important place within our physiology. And so it's only going to let some water-soluble substances through. And what you're going to see is that this is very selective, so we're going to have transport proteins that are able to transport these materials from inside of the bloodstream into the brain tissue. However, some materials will easily pass through the blood-brain barrier. If you think of, highly lipid-soluble materials, those are going to have an easier time getting through this blood-brain barrier. And a lot of lipid-soluble drugs are able to do this without help of a transport protein. But again, this blood-brain barrier just ensures that, we're having a little bit more selective permeability, and we're just not allowing any, stray ions or materials from entering the brain and causing damage to that tissue. Throughout the central nervous system, you will see the circulation of what's called cerebral spinal fluid. And so the fluid is created in the choroid plexus of our four ventricles, two lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and then the fourth ventricle. And so what you see is that this fluid, runs parallel along with venous blood, and the function of the fluid is to, one, serve as protective, like a shock absorber for our central nervous system. Two, it helps to maintain the optimal chemical environment for that nervous tissue. And then three, we're going to be able to, it's going to play a role in exchanging the nutrients and the wastes from the blood to that nervous tissue. Now let's begin to talk about the function of the brain, and first we'll introduce the cranial nerves. So if we took the brain and turned it up, you can see that there are 12 nerves stemming from here, and they have many different functions, but a lot of them deal with the events that occur in the neck and the head. And so you're going to see, there are a lot of muscles to control in the face. When we speak, we have to move our mouths and we have to move the muscles surrounding our eyes in order to get in all this visual input, and our tongue. But, we also have all this sensory information coming in too. The sights, the sounds, the smells. So these cranial nerves will deal with those events as well. But you could also tell that they deal with other things that aren't just occurring in the neck and in the head. So, for example, nerves number 9 and 10, the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerve, they're going to take in information about blood pressure, about oxygen, about CO2, about pH. And then if there isn't an optimal environment at that given moment being picked up by those chemoreceptors, changes can be brought about. So let's say if there's too much CO2 within our bloodstream, then we could increase the depth of our breathing. If blood pressure is too high, we could slow down heart rate and try to bring it down. And so the brain is going to be processing a lot of information all at once and then sending out a lot of motor output. We're going to divide the brain into different sections, in particular the brain stem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. And we're going to talk about all the different functions that are processed within these regions. First, we will discuss our brain stem, which is sometimes referred to as our reptilian brain, because it handles some of the most essential and the most basic functions of biology, including, dealing with our blood pressure and cardiovascular system, our breathing, our sex drive, our, hunger, things like that. And so a lot of that basic information is processed in that brain stem. And it's made up of 3 different parts. The midbrain. In the brain stem, we're going to have clusters of neurons, otherwise known as nuclei. And in the midbrain, 2 of these sections, the substantia nigra and the red nucleus, play a huge role in the movement of our skeletal muscles. And this is my focus of research, and I'll just tell you that we are not going to really go into all of the complexity that is human movement, but there are so many sections of the brain that need to communicate with one another in order to coordinate which muscles should be activated and contract, and then which muscles should be inhibited. And the regulation of all the skeletal muscle contractions during movement is, again, just a very complex and a very intricate system. So those 2 nuclei, the substantia nigra and the red nucleus, play a huge role in that. Also in the midbrain, we have the superior colliculi, which plays a role in eye movement. And there is research also showing that abnormalities in the firing patterns within this region of the brain also could play a role in ADHD. And then we also have the inferior colliculi, which deals with auditory responses and auditory sensory inputs. This is where, a startle response, so, a loud noise occurs and you get startled. This is where that stems from, and also plays a role in eye movement as well. Another section of the brainstem is called the pons, and you'll see that's the middle here within our brainstem, and we have the pontine nuclei, which again play a role in coordination of movement, and then the pons also contains what's called the pons respiratory group, which is going to help regulate our breathing pattern. Then we have the medulla oblongata, which is a very important section of our brainstem because it's going to help regulate our blood pressure and our respiratory system, because the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide is a very important task. As we discussed in earlier chapters, many cells are going to need oxygen for metabolism. And if that oxygen isn't supplied, well, then cells die. And so, we also need to get rid of things like CO2, all these hormones, all these nutrients, all these waste products need to be circulated. And so the medulla plays a huge role in managing the internal environment. And, if blood pressure gets too low or too high, or O2 or CO2 get too low or too high, the medulla is going to process that information and, impact the heart, impact our blood vessels, impact our lungs. So, the brain stem, it serves a very important part in our basic physiology and the things and the functions that we need in order to survive. The cerebellum is located behind the brain stem, and it's going to play a huge role in the movement of our bodies. And it's going to communicate with the brain stem, the motor cortex, and it's also going to be receiving information from the peripheral skeletal muscles. And it's going to, process our bodies in space, and it's going to help fine-tune movements. And so it can directly influence motor pathways, and it's going to play a huge role in maintaining our base of support as we move and maintaining our balance. So the cerebellum is just part of this hugely complex motor pathway that helps regulate all of our movements. The diencephalon is composed of three major parts of the brain, including the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. The thalamus is going to process a lot of the sensory information within our bodies, and then it's going to communicate with the cerebral cortex in order to basically plan out what is going on within our bodies and what motor outputs may need to take place. It also plays a role in our motor control, and it's actually going to directly influence the motor cortex. And the neurons of the thalamus are going to synapse with neurons in the motor cortex and basically dictate which muscles are contracting and which muscles are not contracting. The hypothalamus is a major center within the brain, and it has a lot of nuclei that control a lot of body functions. So the different functions that are important: one, it is the regulator of our autonomic nervous system. So we're either in fight or flight or rest and digest. We're going to talk more about this I believe it's even the next lecture. And so we have that sympathetic and that parasympathetic nervous system, and the hypothalamus is going to regulate which state we're currently in. And it's going to help also produce and regulate much of our endocrine system or much of our hormonal system. So again, when we get into that chapter, we'll talk more about it. But the hypothalamus regulates and produces many hormones found in our bodies. It also plays a role in our emotions, in the regulation of eating and drinking, our body temperature, and our sleep patterns. Last, we have the pineal gland, which plays a huge role in our sleep and wake cycles. And so when it gets dark and there's limited light, it turns nighttime out, it's going to secrete melatonin, which helps us get ready or get prepared for sleep. Next, we'll talk about the largest part of our brain, which is the cerebral cortex, or the cerebrum. And it is often called the seat of intelligence because, functions like reading, writing, language, math, music, art, all take place within this area of the brain. And it's going to serve not only in these sorts of things, but it's also going to play a role in processing sensory information for developing our motor patterns and our motor output. So it's a really integral part of the brain, and it's going to have a lot of communication between different sections in order to carry out functions. Here we see a layout of the cerebral cortex and the different sections and the different areas of that brain and all the different functions that the cerebral cortex process. So you could see that, of course, there's going to be these different sections, but there's going to be a lot of communication between these sections in order to carry out some of our most basic functions. Again, we have to process a lot of information, and so we have distinct senses that allow our brains to process the environment around us. And so we have the primary somatosensory cortex, which deals with things like touch and pressure and vibration. And so all these somatosensory stimuli are going to be processed here in this primary somatosensory cortex. But we also have the visual cortex, which is going to deal with all of the information coming in through our photoreceptors in our eyes. And then we have a primary auditory cortex. And then in addition, one's for taste and then one's for smell. In addition to sensory information, the cerebral cortex also has to deliver motor outputs. And one of these areas is called the primary motor cortex, which is going to deal with the contraction of our skeletal muscles. And so when we need to move, the primary motor cortex, depending on which section that is being active at the time, that section is going to basically drive upper motor neurons, are going to send messages to lower motor neurons to carry out that contraction. And the primary motor cortex has what's called contralateral control, meaning that the left side of the motor cortex deals with skeletal muscle contractions on the right side of the body, and then the right side of the motor cortex deals with contractions on the left side of the body. And what's cool about the primary motor cortex is that we basically have it mapped out, and we know it, depending on which section is active, that is going to have direct control over certain skeletal muscle groups. We also have motor areas that deal with other functions, such as speech, and one of these areas is called Broca's area, located in the frontal lobe, and it's going to play a role in our language and our communication. We also have what's called association areas in the cerebral cortex, and while sensory areas pick up this sensory information, a lot of times the code needs to be processed by other areas of the brain. So these association areas, they will deal with the sensory information and integrate sort of the message that needs to take place in order to deliver it to other sections of the brain. So we have some somatosensory association areas, visual association areas, and then facial recognition areas. So, all of this information that we're getting from the peripheral, from our eyes, the things that we're processing, there are a lot of different sections that are dealing with this information and then basically mapping out the steps that need to take place or the certain functions that need to occur. We'll highlight the other association areas of the cerebral cortex, but a lot of times you're able to tell what they process based on those names. And so the auditory association area, that's going to help you pin a certain sound, to your memory. And the sound like the ice cream truck coming down the road as a kid, that those sounds automatically, trigger that response that, ooh, I want ice cream, right? So some of that processing is taking place here. And then we have the orbital frontal cortex, which helps with the processing of certain smells. Wernicke's area, which helps with language and our communication and the processing of words. The common integrative area, which takes in sensory information to help form our thoughts. The prefrontal cortex, which is going to play a role in our personality, our intellect, learning. And then the premotor cortex, which serves as a memory bank for certain movements. And so, when you are training, for example, and you're completing a certain movement, let's say like a deadlift, right? So all the coordination of that is going to take place in that premotor cortex, and then the premotor cortex synapses with the primary motor cortex in order to help actually carry out those moves. So these association areas, they just serve as, again, part of the computer processing of the brain. So we're taking in the sensory information, processing it in certain areas of the brain, and then there's some sort of motor output or thought that helps us carry out day-to-day functions. We also have what is called the basal nuclei, or sometimes called the basal ganglia. But the basal nuclei play an important role within our motor function. And so the areas like the striatum, the substantia nigra, the thalamus, they're all going to play this huge role in our motor processing and communicate with the premotor and the primary motor areas in order to actually map out movements. But certain sections of the basal ganglia also deal with other things, such as the GABA system, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it plays a role in calming down, certain neurons when they are active. We also have, things like memory and learning, sleep, emotion, our drive and reward system from dopamine is being processed here as well. But this basal nuclei, it plays a huge role in the movement of our skeletal muscles and in the coordination of movement. So those are all the different sections of the brain. And again, I didn't really go into too much detail for each of them, and I really could go into further detail with a lot of different functions. Like, for example, we have a huge communication system within the cerebral cortex known as the limbic system, which helps process our many different emotions. And the brain is going to play a role in our sleep and wake cycles and language and emotions. But these are all very complex functions. And I think for exercise and kinesiology and health, I really more so just wanted to pin out the different areas of the brain and the different functions that those sections regulate. I'm going to end the lecture here, but just make sure you go back and the different areas of the brain, you're knowing what they're comprised of and the different functions that those areas of the brain will regulate. That will conclude our discussion on the central nervous system, but we're going to continue with our conversation on the nervous system and begin to talk about the other different branches. So we'll be discussing the autonomic nervous system and then the somatic nervous system, and then going into how the nervous system actually controls movement within our bodies. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you next video.